Of all the world's most famous monsters, the nefarious Count Dracula has stood the test of time like few ever have. What is it about this titular blood-sucking scourge of the night that has continued to capture the imagination of people the world over for centuries? It's time to put the bite on Dracula's fiction and reality. Dracula began his fictitious life as an 1897 Gothic horror novel by Irish author Bram Stoker. It introduced the character of Count Dracula and established many conventions of subsequent vampire fantasy. The novel tells the story of Dracula's attempt to move from Transylvania to England so that he may find new blood, both figuratively and literally, and spread his undead curse. Thankfully for the living, a battle ensues between Dracula and a small group of men and a woman, led by a character who would go on to become one of literature's greatest heroes, Professor Abraham Van Helsing. Dracula was published in London in May 1897 by Archibald Constable and Company. Costing 6 shillings, the novel was bound with yellow cloth and titled in red letters. It was copyrighted in the United States in 1899 with the publication by Doubleday and McClure of New York. But when Universal Studios purchased the rights, it came to light that Bram Stoker had not complied with a portion of US copyright law, placing the novel into the public domain. In the United Kingdom and other countries following the Berne Convention on Copyrights, the novel was under copyright until April 1962, 50 years after Stoker's death. Over the years, Dracula has been assigned to many literary genres, including vampire literature, horror fiction, the Gothic novel, and invasion literature. The novel has spawned numerous theatrical, film, and television interpretations, and this nocturnal phantom's reign of terror is far from over. The main story of Count Dracula is told through a series of letters, diary entries, newspaper articles, and ship's log entries, whose narrators are the novel's protagonists, and occasionally supplemented with newspaper clippings relating events not directly witnessed. The events portrayed in the novel take place chronologically, and largely in England and Transylvania during the 1890s. All of the events in this torrid tale transpire within the same year, between May the 3rd and November the 6th. A short note is located at the end of the final chapter, written 7 years after the events outlined in the novel. The story begins with Jonathan Harker, a newly qualified English solicitor, visiting Count Dracula at his castle in the Carpathian Mountains on the border of Transylvania, Bukovina, and Moldavia to provide legal support for a real estate transaction overseen by Harker's employer, Mr. Peter Hawkins of Exeter. At first enticed by Dracula's gracious manners, Harker soon realizes that he is Dracula's prisoner. Wandering the Count's castle against Dracula's admonition, Harker encounters 3 female vampires, called Sisters, from whom he is rescued by Dracula himself. Harker soon realizes that Dracula is also a vampire. After the preparations are made, Dracula leaves Transylvania and abandons Harker to the Sisters. After a series of blood-curdling events, Harker barely escapes from the castle with his life. Dracula boards a Russian ship, the Demeter, taking along with him boxes of Transylvanian soil which he required in order to regain his strength. Not long afterward, the ship, having weighed anchor at Varna, runs aground on the shores of Whitby in the east coast of England. The captain's log narrates the gradual disappearance of the entire crew until the captain alone remained, himself bound to the helm to maintain course. An animal resembling a large dog is seen leaping ashore. This is the Count in animal form. One of Dracula's many talents is that he possesses the ability to shapeshift into animals like wolves and, of course, bats. The ship's cargo is described as silver sand and 50 boxes of mold or earth from Transylvania. It is later learned that Dracula successfully purchased multiple estates under the alias Count de Ville throughout London, and devised to distribute the 50 boxes to each of them, utilizing transportation services as well as moving them himself. He does this to secure for himself lairs, and the 50 boxes of earth would be used as his graves, which would grant safety and rest during times of feeding and replenishing his strength. Harker's fiancée Mina Murray is staying with her friend Lucy Westenra, who is holidaying in Whitby. Lucy receives 3 marriage proposals from Dr. John Seawood, Quincy Morris, and Arthur Holmwood, the son of Lord Godalming, who later obtains the title himself. Lucy accepts Holmwood's proposal while turning down Seawood and Morris, but all remain friends. Dracula communicates with Seawood's patient, Renfield, an insane man who wishes to consume insects, spiders, birds, and rats to absorb their life force. Renfield is able to detect Dracula's presence and supplies clues accordingly. Soon, Dracula is indirectly shown to be stalking Lucy. As time passes, she begins to suffer from episodes of sleepwalking and dementia, as witnessed by Mina. When Lucy begins to waste away suspiciously, Seawood invites his old teacher, Abraham Van Helsing, who immediately determines the true cause of Lucy's condition. He refuses to disclose it, but diagnoses her with acute blood loss. Van Helsing prescribes numerous blood transfusions, to which he, Seawood, Quincy, and Arthur all contribute over time. Van Helsing also prescribes garlic flowers to be placed throughout her room, and weaves a necklace of withered garlic blossoms for her to wear. However, she continues to waste away, appearing to lose blood every night. While both doctors are absent, Lucy and her mother are attacked by a wolf, and Mrs. Westenra, who has a heart condition, dies of fright. Van Helsing attempts to protect her with garlic, but fate thwarts him each night, whether Lucy's mother removes the garlic from her room or Lucy herself does so in her restless sleep. The doctors have found 2 small puncture marks above her neck, which Dr. Seawood is at a loss to understand. After Lucy dies, Van Helsing places a golden crucifix over her mouth, ostensibly to delay or prevent Lucy's vampiric conversion. Fate conspires against him again when Van Helsing finds the crucifix in the possession of one of the servants who stole it off Lucy's corpse. Following Lucy's death and burial, the newspapers report children being stalked in the night by a bloofer lady, that is, a beautiful lady. Van Helsing, knowing Lucy has become a vampire, confides in Seawood, Lord Godalming, and Morris. The suitors and Van Helsing track her down and, after a confrontation with her, stake her heart, behead her, and fill her mouth with garlic. Around the same time, Jonathan Harker arrives from Budapest, where Mina marries him after his escape, and he and Mina join the campaign against Dracula. The vampire hunters stay at Dr. Seawood's residence, holding nightly meetings and providing reports based on each of their various tasks. Mina discovers that each of their journals and letters collectively contain clues to which they can track him down. She tasks herself with collecting them, researching newspaper clippings, fitting the most relevant entries into chronological order, and typing out copies to distribute to each of the party which they are to study. Jonathan Harker tracks down the shipments of boxed graves and the estates which Dracula has purchased in order to store them. Van Helsing conducts research along with Dr. Seawood to analyse the behaviour of their patient Renfield, who they learn is directly influenced by Dracula. They also research historical events, folklore, and superstitions from various cultures to understand Dracula's powers and weaknesses. Van Helsing also establishes a criminal profile on Dracula in order to better understand his actions and predict his movements. Arthur Holmwood's fortune assists in funding the entire operation and expenses. As they discover the various properties Dracula has purchased, the male protagonists team up to raid each property and are several times confronted by Dracula. As they discover each of the boxed graves scattered throughout London, They pry them open to place and seal wafers of sacramental bread within. This act renders the boxes of earth completely useless to Dracula, as he is unable to open, enter, or further transport them. This curses Mina with vampirism and changes her, but does not completely turn her into a vampire. Van Helsing attempts to bless Mina through prayer and by placing a wafer of sacrament against her forehead, but it burns her upon contact, leaving a wretched scar. Under this curse, Mina turns from consciousness to a semi-trance, during which she perceives Dracula's surroundings and actions. Van Helsing is able to use hypnotism twice a day, at dawn and at sunset, to put her into this trance to further track Dracula's movements. Mina, afraid of Dracula's link with her, urges the team not to tell her their plans out of fear that Dracula will be listening. After the protagonists discover and sterilize 49 boxes found throughout his lairs in London, they learn that Dracula has fled with the missing 50th box back to his castle in Transylvania. They pursue him under the guidance of Mina. They split up into teams once they reach Europe. Van Helsing and Mina team up to locate the castle of Dracula, while the others attempt to ambush the boat Dracula is using to reach his home. Van Helsing raids the castle and destroys the vampire sisters. Upon discovering Dracula being transported by gypsies, the three teams converge and attack the caravan carrying Dracula in the 50th box of earth. After dispatching many gypsies who were sworn to protect the Count, Harker shears Dracula through the throat with a razor-sharp knife known as a kukri, while the mortally wounded Quincy stabs the Count in the heart with a bowie knife. Dracula crumbles to dust, and Mina is freed from her curse of vampirism as the scar on her forehead disappears. Soon after, Quincy dies from his wounds. The book closes with a note left by Jonathan Harker 7 years after the events of the novel, detailing his married life with Mina and the birth of their son, whom they name after all 4 members of the party but address as Quincy. Quincy is depicted sitting on the knee of Van Helsing as they recount their adventure. Seward and Arthur have each gotten married. The book also had a neat deleted ending. There once was a small section that was removed from a draft of the final chapter, in which Dracula's castle falls apart as he dies, hiding the fact that vampires were ever there. The scene from the original Dracula manuscript reads as follows. As we looked, there came a terrible convulsion of the earth, so that we seemed to rock to and fro and fell to our knees. At the same moment, with a roar which seemed to shake the very heavens, the whole castle and the rock and even the hill on which it stood seemed to rise into the air and scatter in fragments, while a mighty cloud of black and yellow smoke, volume on volume in rolling grandeur, was shot upwards with inconceivable rapidity. Then there was a stillness in nature, as the echoes of that thunderous report seemed to come as with the hollow boom of a thunderclap, the long and reverberating roll which seems as though the floors of heaven shook. Then down in a mighty ruin falling whence they rose, came the fragments that had been tossed skywards in the cataclysm. From where we stood, it seemed as though the one fierce volcano burst had satisfied the need of nature, and that the castle and the structure of the hill had sunk again into the void. We were so appalled with the suddenness and the grandeur that we forgot to think of ourselves. Between 1879 and 1898, Stoker was a business manager for the Lyceum Theatre in London, where he supplemented his income by writing a large number of sensational novels, his most successful being the vampire tale Dracula, published on the 26th of May 1897. Parts of it are set around the town of Whitby, where he spent summer holidays. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, authors such as H. Rider Haggard, Rudyard Kipling, Robert Louis Stevenson, Arthur Conan Doyle and H. G. Wells wrote many tales in which fantastic creatures threatened the British Empire. Invasion literature was at a peak, and Stoker's formula was very familiar by 1897 to readers of fantastic adventure stories of an invasion of England by continental European influences. Victorian readers enjoyed Dracula as a good adventure story like many others, but it did not reach its legendary status until later in the 20th century, when film versions began to appear. Shakespearean actor and friend of Stoker's, Sir Henry Irving, was a possible real-life inspiration for the character of Dracula. The role was tailor-made to his dramatic presence, gentlemanly mannerisms, and affinity for playing villainous roles. Irving, however, never agreed to play the part on stage. Instead, the part of Dracula was given to classic film actor Bela Lugosi. Lugosi was a Hungarian-American actor who will always be best remembered for portraying Count Dracula in the 1931 film. After playing small parts on the stage in his native Hungary, Lugosi gained his first role in a film in 1917. He had to leave the country after the failed Hungarian Communist Revolution of 1919 because of his socialist activism. He acted in several films in Weimar, Germany, before arriving in the United States as a seaman on a merchant ship. Lugosi was approached in the summer of 1927 to star in a Broadway theatre production of Dracula, which had been adapted by Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston from Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. The Horace Liverite production was successful, running for 261 performances before touring the United States to much fanfare and critical acclaim throughout 1928 and 1929. In 1928, Lugosi decided to stay in California when the play ended its West Coast run. His performance had piqued the interest of Fox Film, and he was cast in the studio's silent film 1929's The Veiled Woman. He also appeared in the 1929 film Prisoners, believed lost, which was released in both silent and talkie versions. In 1929, with no other film roles in sight, he returned to the stage as Dracula for a short West Coast tour of the play. Lugosi remained in California, where he resumed his film work under contract with Fox, appearing in early talkies often as a heavy or an exotic sheik. He also continued to lobby for his prized role in the film version of Dracula. Despite his critically acclaimed performance on stage, Lugosi was not Universal Pictures' first choice for the role of Dracula when the company optioned the rights to the Dean play and began production in 1930. Different prominent actors were considered before Browning cast Lugosi for the role, but the film was a hit. Lugosi died of a heart attack on August 16, 1956, while lying on a bed in his Los Angeles apartment. He was 73. He was buried wearing one of the Dracula cape costumes in the Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. Contrary to popular belief, Lugosi never requested to be buried in his cloak. Bela Lugosi Jr. confirmed on numerous occasions that he and his mother Lillian actually made the decision, but believed that it is what his father would have wanted. To this very day, the character of Dracula remains very much tied to Lugosi's masterful portrayal. Before writing Dracula, Stoker spent several years researching European folklore and stories of vampires, being most influenced by Emily Gerard's 1885 essay, Transylvania Superstitions, which includes content about a vampire myth. So who was Stoker's Count Dracula? The Count is considered to be both the prototypical and the archetypal vampire in subsequent works of fiction. He is also depicted in the novel to be the origin of werewolf legends. One of Dracula's most mysterious powers is the ability to turn others into vampires by biting them. Other character aspects have been either added or altered in subsequent popular fictional works. Starring as Dracula in a sequence of Hammer horror films which began with Dracula in 1958, Christopher Lee fixed the image of the fanged vampire in pop culture. The character has appeared frequently in popular culture, from films to animated media to breakfast cereals. Stoker's Count Dracula is an undead, centuries-old vampire and a Transylvanian nobleman who claims to be a Sekeli descended from Attila the Hun. He inhabits a decaying castle in the Carpathian Mountains near the Borgo Pass. Unlike the vampires of Eastern European folklore, which are portrayed as repulsive, corpse-like creatures, Dracula is handsome and charismatic, with a veneer of aristocratic charm. In his conversations with Jonathan Harker, he reveals himself as deeply proud of his boyar heritage and nostalgia for the past, which he admits have become only a memory of heroism, honour and valour in modern times. Although early in the novel Dracula dons a mask of cordiality, he often flies into fits of rage when his plans are frustrated. When Dracula's brides attempt to seduce Jonathan Harker, Dracula physically assaults one and ferociously berates them for their insubordination. He has an appreciation for ancient architecture, and when purchasing a home he prefers them to be aged, saying a new home would kill me, and that to make a new home habitable to him would take a century. Dracula is very proud of his warrior heritage, proclaiming his pride to Harker on how the Sekeli people are infused with the blood of heroes. He also expresses an interest in the history of the British Empire, speaking admiringly of its people. He has a somewhat primal and predatory worldview. He pities ordinary humans for their revulsion to their darker impulses. He is not without human emotions, however, as he often says that he too can love. Though usually portrayed as having a strong Eastern European accent, the original novel only specifies that his spoken English is excellent, though strangely toned. His appearance varies in age. He is described early in the novel as thin, with a long white moustache, pointed ears and sharp teeth. It is also noted later in the novel by a zookeeper who sees him that he has a hooked nose and a pointed beard with a streak of white in it. He is dressed all in black and has hair on his palms. Harker describes him as an old man, cruel-looking and giving an effect of extraordinary pallor. When angered, the Count shows his true bestial nature, his blue eyes flaming red. As the novel progresses, Dracula is described as taking on a more and more youthful appearance. After Harker strikes him with a shovel, he is left with a scar on his forehead, which he bears throughout the course of the novel. Dracula also possesses great wealth and has gypsies in his homeland who are loyal to him as servants and protectors. Count Dracula is portrayed in the novel using many different supernatural abilities, and is believed to have gained his abilities through dealings with the devil. Chapter 18 of the novel describes many of the abilities, limitations and weaknesses of vampires and Dracula in particular. Dracula has superhuman strength which, according to Van Helsing, is equivalent to that of 20 strong men. He does not cast a shadow or have a reflection from mirrors. He is immune to conventional means of attack. A sailor tried to stab him in the back with a knife, but the blade goes through his body as though it is air. He can defy gravity to a certain extent and possesses superhuman agility, able to climb vertical surfaces upside down in a reptilian manner. He can travel onto unhallowed ground, such as the graves of suicides and those of his victims. He has powerful hypnotic, telepathic and illusionary abilities. He also has the ability, within limitations, to vanish and reappear elsewhere at will. If he knows the path, he can come out from anything or into anything regardless of how close it is bound, even if it is fused with fire. He has amassed cunning and wisdom throughout centuries, and he is unable to die by the mere passing of time alone. Dracula can command animals such as rats, owls, bats, moths, foxes and wolves. However, his control over these animals is limited, as seen when the party first enters his house in London. Although Dracula is able to summon thousands of rats to swarm and attack the group, Holmwood summons his trio of terriers to do battle with the rats. The dogs prove very efficient rat killers, suggesting they are Manchester Terriers trained for that purpose. Terrified by the dogs' onslaught, the rats flee, and any control which Dracula had over them is gone. Dracula can manipulate the weather and, within his range, is able to direct the elements such as storms, fog, and mist. As we told you earlier, Dracula can change form at will, able to grow and become small, his featured forms in the novel being that of a bat, a wolf, a large dog, and a fog or mist. When the moonlight is shining, he can travel as elemental dust within its rays. He is able to pass through tiny cracks or crevices while retaining his human form or in the form of a vapour, described by Van Helsing as the ability to slip through a hair-breadth space of a tomb door or a coffin. This is also an ability used by his victim Lucy as a vampire. When the party breaks into her tomb, they dismantle the secured coffin to find it completely empty, her corpse being no longer located within. One of Dracula's most notable powers is the ability to turn others into vampires by biting them. According to Van Helsing in the novel, when they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind. And so the circle goes on, ever widening, like as the ripples from a stone thrown in the water. Friend Arthur, if you had met that kiss which you knew of before poor Lucy died, or again, last night, when you opened your arms to her, you would, in time when you had died, have become Nosferatu, as they call it in Eastern Europe, and would for all time make more of those undeads that so have filled us with horror. According to Dr. Seward's journal in Dracula chapter 16, the vampire bite itself does not cause death. It is the method vampires use to drain blood of the victims and to increase their influence over them. This is described by Van Helsing. The Nosferatu do not die like the bees when they sting once. He is only stronger, and being stronger, have yet more power to work evil. Dracula requires no other sustenance but fresh human blood, which has the effect of rejuvenating him and allowing him to grow younger. His power is drawn from the blood of others, and he cannot survive without it. Although drinking blood can rejuvenate his youth and strength, it does not give him the ability to regenerate. Months after being struck on the head by a shovel, he still bears a scar from the impact. Dracula's preferred victims are women. Harker states that he believes Dracula has a state of fasting as well as a state of feeding. Dracula does state to Mina, however, that exerting his abilities causes a desire to feed. Count Dracula is depicted as the king vampire and can control other vampires. To punish Mina and the party for their efforts against him, Dracula bites her on at least 3 occasions. He also forces her to drink his blood. This act curses her with the effects of vampirism and gives him a telepathic link to her thoughts. However, hypnotism was only able to be done before dawn. Van Helsing refers to the act of drinking blood by both the vampire and the victim as the vampire's baptism of blood. For all of his superhuman strengths, the Count does have his fair share of weaknesses. Dracula is much less powerful in daylight and is only able to shift his form at dawn, noon, and dusk. He can shift his form freely at night, or if he is at his grave. The sun is not fatal to him, as sunlight does not burn and destroy him upon contact, though most of his abilities cease. The sun that rose on our sorrow this morning guards us in its course. Until it sets to night, that monster must retain whatever form he has now. He is confined within the limitations of his earthly envelope. He cannot melt into thin air, nor disappear through cracks or chinks or crannies. If he go through a doorway, he must open the door like a mortal. Dracula has a bloodlust which he is seemingly unable to control. At the sight of blood, he becomes enveloped in a demonic fury which is fueled by the need to feed. Other adaptations call this uncontrollable state the thirst. There are items which afflict him to the point he has no power, and can even calm him from his insatiable appetite for blood. He is repulsed by garlic, as well as sacred items and symbols such as crucifixes and sacramental bread. Placing the branch of a wild rose upon the top of his coffin will render him unable to escape it. A sacred bullet fired into the coffin could kill him so that he remained true dead. Mountain ash is also described as a form of protection from a vampire, although the effects are unknown. This was believed to be used as protection against evil spirits and witches during the Victorian era. The state of rest to which vampires are prone during the day is described in the novel as a death-like sleep in which the vampire sleeps open-eyed, is unable to awaken or move, and also may be unaware of any presence of individuals who may be trespassing. Dracula is portrayed as being active in daylight at least once in order to pursue a victim. Dracula also purchases many properties throughout London over the counter, which shows that he does have the ability to have some type of presence in daylight. While universally feared by the local people of Transylvania and even beyond, Dracula commands the loyalty of gypsies and a band of Slovaks who transport his boxes on their way to London and to serve as an armed convoy bringing his coffin back to his castle. The Slovaks and gypsies appear to know his true nature, for they laugh at Harker when he tries to communicate his plight, and betray Harker's attempt to send a letter through them by giving it to the Count. Dracula seems to be able to hold influence over people with mental disorders, such as Renfield, who is never bitten but who worships Dracula, referring to him over the course of the novel as Master and Lord. Dracula also afflicts Lucy with chronic sleepwalking, putting her into a trance-like state that allows them not only to submit to his will, but also seek him and satisfy his need to feed. Dracula's powers and weaknesses vary greatly in the many adaptations. Previous and subsequent vampires from different legends have had similar vampire characteristics. So what of the real-life inspirations for Count Dracula? Some historians are convinced that a historic figure, Vlad Dracula, often called Vlad the Impaler, was the model for Stoker's Count, though there is no supporting evidence. Stoker is said to have only borrowed scraps of miscellaneous information, according to one expert, about this bloodthirsty tyrant of Wallachia, and there are no comments about him in Stoker's working notes. Dracula scholar Elizabeth Miller has remarked that aside from the name and some mention of Romanian history, the background of Stoker's Count bears no resemblance to that of Vlad Dracula. From 1890 to 1897, Stoker was a member of the London Library, where markings in Sabine Baring-Gould's Book of Werewolves, Thomas Brown's Pseudodoxica Epidemica, A.F. Cross's Roundabout the Carpathians, and Charles Boner's Transylvania are attributed to Stoker's research for Dracula. Later, he also claimed that he had a nightmare caused by eating too much crab meat about a vampire king rising from his grave. Yes, eating too much seafood will do it to you every time. The Dead Undead was one of Stoker's original titles for Dracula, and the manuscript was entitled simply The Undead up until a few weeks before publication. Stoker's notes for Dracula show that the name of the Count was originally Count Vampire, but Stoker became intrigued by the name Dracula while doing research, after reading William Wilkinson's 1820 book, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia with political observations relative to them, which he found in the Whitby Library and consulted a number of times during visits to Whitby in the 1890s. The name Dracula was the ancestral name Draculea of the descendants of Vlad II of Wallachia, who took the name Dracul after being invested in the Order of the Dragon in 1431. In the old Romanian language, the word Dracul meant the dragon, and Dracula meant son of the dragon. In the present day, however, Dracul means the devil. Many of Stoker's biographers and literary critics have found strong similarities to the earlier Irish writer Sheridan Le Fanu's classic of the vampire genre, Carmilla. In writing Dracula, Stoker may also have drawn on stories about the Shay, some of which feature blood-drinking women. the Irish legend of Avatak has also been suggested as a source. It is also thought probable that his mother's stories of events during the severe cholera outbreak in Sligo in 1832 were influential, particularly themes of being buried while alive. In 1983, American author and a professor of Russian and East European history Raymond McNally additionally suggested that Stoker was influenced by the history of Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who allegedly tortured and killed between 36 and 700 young women. It was later a commonly believed rumour that she committed these crimes to bathe in their blood, believing that this preserved her youth. Bathory's castle was also located in the Carpathian Mountains, just as Dracula's, albeit in a different region. In her book The Essential Dracula, Claire Howard Maiden suggested that the castle of Count Dracula was inspired by Slains Castle, at which Bram Stoker was a guest of the 19th Earl of Errol. According to Miller, he first visited Cruden Bay in 1893, 3 years after work had begun on Dracula. Haining and Tremaine maintained that during this visit, Stoker was especially impressed by Slains Castle's interior and the surrounding landscape. Dracula scholar Elizabeth Miller questions the stringency of this connection. Possibly Stoker was not inspired by a real edifice at all, but by Jules Verne's 1892 novel, The Carpathian Castle, or Anne Radcliffe's 1794 tale, The Mysteries of Udolpho. A third possibility is that he copied information about Kemeny Castle at Vex from one of his sources on Transylvania, the book by Major E.C. Johnson. A further option is that Stoker saw an illustration of Bran Castle in the book on Transylvania by Charles Boner. Many of the scenes in Whitby and London are based on real places that Stoker frequently visited, although he distorts the geography for the sake of the story in some cases. One scholar has suggested that Stoker chose Whitby as the site of Dracula's first appearance in England because of the Synod of Whitby, given the novel's preoccupation with timekeeping and calendar disputes. British writer and broadcaster Daniel Farson, British political theorist, author, publisher and civil servant Leonard Woolf, and author Peter Haining have suggested that Stoker received much historical information from Armin Vambery, a Hungarian professor whom he met at least twice. Miller argues, there is nothing to indicate that the conversation included Vlad, vampires, or even Transylvania. And furthermore, there is no record of any correspondence between Stoker and Vambery, nor is Vambery mentioned in Stoker's notes for Dracula. Dracula was not an immediate bestseller when it was first published, but critics lavished their praise upon it with great enthusiasm. The contemporary Daily Mail ranked Stoker's powers above those of Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe, as well as Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. According to literary historians Nina Auerbach and David J. Scal in the Northern Critical Edition, the novel has become more significant for modern readers than it was for Victorian readers, most of whom enjoyed it just as a good adventure story. It reached its broad and iconic status only later in the 20th century when the movie versions appeared. Despite the book's popularity, it did not make much money for Stoker. In the last year of his life, he was so poor that he had to petition for a compassionate grant from the Royal Literary Fund, and his widow was forced to sell his notes and outlines of the novel at a Sotheby's auction in 1913, where they were purchased for as little as £2. But then, F. W. Murnau's unauthorized adaptation of the story was released in theatres in 1922 in the form of Nosferatu. Stoker's widow took affront, and during the legal battle that followed, the novel's popularity started to grow. Nosferatu was followed by a highly successful stage adaptation, touring the UK for 3 years before arriving in the US, where Stoker's creation caught Hollywood's attention, and after the American 1931 movie version was released, the book has never been out of print. However, some Victorian fans were ahead of the time, describing it as the sensation of the season and the most blood-curdling novel of the paralysed century. Sherlock Holmes author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote to Stoker in a letter, "I write to tell you how very much I have enjoyed reading Dracula. I think it is the very best story of diablerie which I have read for many years." The Daily Mail review of the 1st of June 1897 proclaimed it a classic of Gothic horror. In seeking a parallel to this weird, powerful and horrible story, our minds revert to such tales as The Mysteries of Udolpho, Frankenstein, The Fall of the House of Usher. But Dracula is even more appalling in its gloomy fascination than any one of these. Count Dracula, in all of his various incarnations, has permeated every facet of pop culture and remains an icon of both the stage, the screen, and of course the written word. His legend will continue on for lifetimes to come, if only because you just cannot keep a good ghoul down.